Hello and welcome to CS230. This is lecture 12 and lesson 3. And in this particular lesson we're going to look at an overview of single page applications, and we're going to look at AngularJS, which is a way to implement model view model type structures or model view controller type structures in web pages. And it's web design, and really we're using it as a framework to do all this two-way binding stuff and structuring the organization of our code in much the same way as we did, but it'll make it a little bit easier for us so we don't have to write all this low-level JavaScript. So for this lesson, I'm going to switch over and use my Keynote and presentation software to quickly go through some of the information that we might like to know about here. So we're interested in single page applications first. So these are web app that loads a single HTML page and then dynamically update that page as the user interacts with the app. And you know that you can do this with Ajax already. Okay, so it uses Ajax HTML5 to create this fluid and responsive web apps without constant page reloads. And that all happens on the client side. It's in JavaScript. And you can make these calls as well, RESTful calls using post and get and all that kind of stuff that we saw earlier with Ajax also. So lots of frameworks that make it easier to create these, of course, and it's a nice way to do it. I'd certainly recommend using this approach. Okay, so we see SPAs sometimes in discussions with mean and rest, and mean and rest are just ways to structure an app and to communicate with the app, the various parts of it. But so they're not always about being a single page. The core concept is that the browser just uses a single URL. You can move around the app, fill out forms, conduct all your normal activity without the location in your browser's address bar ever changing. And it's a simple thing from the user's perspective, has huge implications for the programmer, a lot of JavaScript going on, lots of resources being moved back and forth. It creates the appearance of a single page application. So they pair nicely with mobile device development methodologies like responsive design and all that kind of stuff. They're a really good fit for Mean, which is MongoDB, ExpressJS, AngularJS, and Node.js. It's a framework that we use for designing client-server apps and using RESTful communication, and that's that get, post, put, options type stuff that we saw earlier with HTTP, and we'll see about REST and Mean a little bit later in the module. But for now, we just want to note the distinction between SPAs and MPWs, and MPWs are multi-page websites. Okay, and they also can incorporate MVC, DOM manipulation, Ajax type stuff, but they don't have to use technologies in any formal way. But they're typically controlled by the server. SPAs typically use all or many of the approaches that you see: model view controller, model view model, DOM manipulation, JSON, all that kind of stuff. Their defining feature is that the routing is all handled by the client-side application using JavaScript instead of the server. That means the application handles the browsing instead of the browser. Attempting to mimic the browser using JavaScript is the root cause of problems, though, with SPAs, and it's mostly related to navigation. So the organizational structure of SPAs usually follow MVC or MVVM, or both. Okay, so we think in terms of routing. And SPAs are a nice modern approach to developing web app because they're not without problems, and there is a place for multi-page web development as well. So really what happens is when you type a URL in your browser, you access a page application, you're making a request to view a page within the whole application or to view the SPA. But how do you know which page to render? So when you're building a web app, you have to define what are known as routes, and they're essentially URL patterns associated with different pages. So when someone enters a URL behind the scenes, the application tries to match the URL with none of the predefined routes, and that provides you with a very structured approach when using MVC as your design template. And you can see across on the right that the browser makes a route, talks to the controller, model view, stuff going on, and it ultimately comes back. So what happens is that the user makes a route, talks to the controller, talks to the model, generates a view. The model might come from a database, and that goes back to the user. Okay, we can do all of this using AngularJS. So Angular is a JavaScript framework that can be added to a HTML page using the script tag, and much like you did with Ajax. And I tend to use the Google APIs, and we'll do this. So AngularJS extends the HTML attributes using directives, and they're called ng directives, Angular directives, and binds data to HTML using expressions. So what we end up doing is we create an application in our front end using the ng app directive, and then we have an ng model directive that binds the value of the controls. That's the input, selects, text areas, all that usual UI stuff, to the application data. And the ng bind directive, that actually allows us to be able to bind application data to the HTML view. So we see this whole model view model thing going on here. Okay, look at a simple app. Okay, so here's a div element, and and I close that div. And this then, using the ng-app directive, tells Angular that this div element is the owner of the AngularJS application using the ng-app directive. Now we build a model, and we bind the value of the input field here to the application variable name called name, okay, using the ng model. And then we have a paragraph, a view here, that tells us that we want to bind the inner HTML of the paragraph element to the application variable name using the bind directive. And that's it. That's as simple as it gets. Okay, so you can use the data ng instead of ng if you want to create different namespaces, and that's all fine. And you can use the ng init directive in order to initialize variables associated with the app. So we can have create this variable here. Here's an app like we did last time. Ng init creates a first name, assign the value of John, and then we're binding the variable first name to this particular span element here, and we replace the contents with that. So it's not too bad. So two-way binding happens just by using attributes on tags. Once you've loaded in the Angular first, of course. So we write expressions using expression double chain brackets. And you can also write it like this, okay? But it's nice to be able to have a look, to use the double chains, and Angular will resolve the expression and return the result exactly where the expression is written. So you can have literals, operators, variables, all that kind of stuff. So we could have something like my input plus 5, first name plus last name. Here we create, initiate a variable called color is called light blue in our app, and we're going to tell our input box that the background color is blue, and the model has the value blue as well. So we're looking at the model, the controller, the view. Okay. Generally, we give our apps a name, okay, and so the module will have different parts of the application, and they always belong to control. And we have a controller, and controllers always belong to an app. So here's an app that's defined. We're creating a little script here, creating a module, and we could put them into a separate file, and it's useful to do that. Okay, the dependencies we have are here, square brackets. So here's a simple one, okay, with a controller. So here we have an ng app, my app, ng controller. It's called my control. Okay, first name plus last name. So we're defining these particular expressions here. Okay, so we're adding then the controller here using app.controller, my control. Give it the function, tell it what to do with the variables that we've created up here. Okay, and scope is the application object, so it owns all the variables. So we can access all the variables like first name that we've created here, last name here, using $scope. Okay, it's probably best to put those into a separate file, of course. And you can see some nice examples using Angular as well, if you want. I've got some links and click through, and you can see some nice examples here. Okay, so let's go back and look at our code example. So here's a Hello World program, okay? And all it does is creates, I've taken this one from Stack Overflow for you, and I've made a few small slight changes to it, okay? So here we have the code, our HTML document, our head, creating an app. That just tells us we're going to use the Angular that we've loaded in over here, okay? And we're creating a module in here. Okay, sorry, creating the app. We're having a controller associated with it. It's called Hello World Controller, and there is a variable here called, an expression called message, okay? And the Angular controller is associated with this particular module, okay? It's called, and we're going to pass it this particular information, Hello World Controller. That's the name of the controller, and then it's up here, and we're going to update the message with Hello World as a script. Now notice that we run this after we actually create the various create the app and so forth. Okay, there's a nice code explanation for what's going on here. The ng-app keyword is used to denote that the application should be considered an Angular app. Give any name you like. The controller is used to hold the business logic. In the h1 tag, we want to access the controller, which will have the logic to display Hello World. So we can say we want to access the controller named Hello World Controller, or control. We're using a member variable called message, and that's just a placeholder to hold a message up here. The script tag is used to reference the script, loads all that. So it works through all of the various things here. But basically, the ng controller directive is a keyword that's defined in Angular and it's used to define the controllers in your application. And we'll see a little bit more about that later when we look at these. But it's nice description here. We can see how it all works. If you work through this, it should be fine. The code works and runs. If I have it here, this one, and you briefly saw that the placeholder was there, and we replaced the placeholder with hello world. Okay, so you can have a look at that a little bit later yourselves, and work through the code. Okay, thank you very much for watching.